Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my lecture. In this particular lecture, I'm going to be covering a topic that some of you might know about. It's definitely a very strong, powerful cultural icon in British and American mythology. And in popular culture, this figure is something of a legend. He's definitely a myth that has been created since the murders that he committed. And in today's lecture, I'm going to explore some of the cultural impacts that happened because of this guy's murder. This guy's murders, sorry, he committed about 11 murders, and look at the enduring cultural fascination that still endures today. Now, British people have a lot of strange habits and a lot of strange fascinations. One of them is that they're completely obsessed with murder. The most popular TV shows on, in the UK right now are crime shows, they're detective shows. And it's a very peculiar thing. No one really shares this same kind of obsession, but the British love a good murder mystery. They love kind of reading about the sordid details. They love reading the gruesome details of how it was killed, how the person was killed, how the murderer carried out the murder, the ensuing trial, all the juicy details. It's something to do with the fact, I think, that England and English people are kind of boring, and they're not very interesting. They lead kind of boring lives. So they like to read about the danger and the chaos that happens outside their homes. They like to curl up with a nice cup of coffee and read a good murder mystery. This obsession started in the 19th century, started with the Victorians. It started mostly with the invention and popularization of movable type. It was the printing press that caused, that sparked this national obsession. People loved to read about the murders, they loved to buy newspapers. There were thousands of newspapers, and there were even specialist newspapers that covered just the murders. Normal newspapers would cover regional news, they would cover national news, they would cover politics, and they would cover crime and world affairs and things like that. Demand was so high for people's obsession, for people's fascination with murder and crime, that specialist magazines sprang up, and they made money and sold in their millions because of people just couldn't get enough crime, they couldn't get enough murder. The demand was so high that true life crime couldn't actually keep up, and the invention of the penny dreadful came about. At the time, in order to improve literacy among the Victorian working class, and literacy was always rising during the Victorians, especially in the working class, there was a big push for education. And the penny dreadfuls were insanely popular, mostly because there were special tax breaks by the government for people who started printing presses. So people could make a fantastic amount of money and not actually get taxed too much on the profits that they made. The penny dreadfuls, they cost a penny to buy, which was quite affordable for most people. And they were sold in pamphlet form. So they were about maybe 2 or 3 sheets of A2 paper, 2 or 3 sheets, and they ran on for serials. And they were fantastically popular, and people followed them, people bought them, and the owners of the printing presses, the owners of the publishing companies made a fantastic amount of money. The most popular part of the penny dreadful was the tear-jerking confession and repentance of the murderer. It was often it was really the most popular part of the penny dreadful, and the pressure was on real-life journalists. This was a great example of art imitating life, where the journalists who were covering the real-life crimes were actually under pressure to make the real trials as captivating and romantic as the fictional trials that people were buying and reading about in the penny dreadfuls. If the criminals in the court didn't have a spectacular confession that revealed everything and would sell a lot of newspapers, the journalists would just make things up. They would make everything up. So at the time, not many people would take time out to go to the courts and double-check this. So fact-checking wasn't a big thing. Nobody could really jump on the internet and check that someone actually said something. You had to get access to the court records. So the journalists could really make whatever they wanted up and print it in the newspapers. No one was going to take them to court about this. Now, the awareness of this crime, of this level of crime, and the way that the police forces combated it, led the Victorians to have a kind of a new awareness. They were very socially aware, and they wanted to push for reforms. The moral issues that were brought into sharp focus by the violence of the crimes that they read about in the newspapers really showed the upper classes and the educated classes how bad things had gotten for the working classes, for the people that were actually making their food, for the people that were doing all the horrible jobs. They were living in squalor, they were living in poverty. And the Victorians really pressured the government to form a police force. Also, at the time, there was a tremendous amount of wealth flowing into Britain. The empire was at its height, and there was huge amounts of money coming in from Africa, from the diamond mines, from the gold mines in India as well, and all the new fresh goods, all the new inventions and new discoveries that were being sold, spices and clothes, things like that. They were bringing a tremendous amount of money into the upper classes and the educated classes in England. So obviously these people wanted to protect their money, they wanted to protect their material goods. So they really put pressure on the government to form a police force that could protect them and hopefully improve the lives of the ordinary working class. It's at around this time that we have some of our most famous, enduring cultural icons. You might recognize the guy here. One of the guys here is obviously Sherlock Holmes. He was created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle at the end of the 19th century. He was created in the 1880s. Fantastically popular character. He was so popular, and the police force in the Victorian era was in its infancy at such an early stage. It was such a kind of an embryonic thing that people, police officers and detectives would actually write in to Sherlock Holmes at 221B Baker Street to ask for advice in solving real-life crimes. They really, really thought that this guy was real. Of course, he wasn't real, he was just in a lot of fantastically popular novels. And over time, over the last 100 years or so, 120 years, he's actually been turned into a mythical figure. And he can look at you and he can say, you know, reveal your most intimate secrets just by looking at a stain on your trousers or something like that. His mind and the stories have merged together. His sharpness of mind, the stories that he's in, they become legendary. There are people that have never read the books. There are people that have never seen the movies. They know what Sherlock Holmes does. The elderly woman that you can see here is one of Agatha Christie's most famous creations. Agatha Christie was a fantastically popular crime writer. Again, murder is what sells books in England. Miss Marple here, she's kind of basically just an old woman who goes around gossiping about people's private lives. But because she goes around solving murders, she's suddenly elevated to the status of a saint. People have made movies about this, people make TV shows, long-running TV shows in the UK, things that go on for 12 or 15 years. They're fantastically popular. People still make money off them. They're still the same old stories that were written at the start of the 20th century, in the 1920s and the 1930s. And it all came about because of this British obsession with crime stories, murder, and gruesome, gory details of how people can be killed. The gentleman at the bottom with the mustache, this is another creation of Agatha Christie's, and it's a guy called Hercule Poirot. He's a Belgian detective. He used to be a Belgian police officer. He came over. The story was in his fictional biography that he came over to England, during the Second World War and started work as a private detective. Again, the actor that you can see here, this is David Suchet. He is actually most famous. He's a very famous actor, but he's most famous for playing this role of Hercule Poirot on TV. He's not really famous for anything else. He's done a lot of other stuff, but he's most famous for playing a detective who solves grisly, gruesome murders. If you were reading a newspaper in the 1860s or the 1830s, you would read news reports like this one. Now, the Daily Telegraph, I don't know if you're aware of this newspaper, the Daily Telegraph is a solid, good newspaper, famous for its great reporting, famous for good, solid investigative journalism, good, solid writers who work for them. This is how they reported one of the first sensational trials in the UK. As news of the murder spread, a feverish fear emerged. It was said that no one knew when they opened their carriage door that they might not find blood on the cushion. Not a parent would entrust his daughter to the train without a horrid anxiety. Not a traveller took his seat without feeling how he runs his chance. This is really emotional, sensational language. It's not something that we would expect from a serious newspaper, but it's how the Daily Telegraph reported the news of Thomas Briggs. Thomas Briggs was killed by a German called Franz Müller, and he was basically killed for a gold watch. His body was found on the tracks, and the police in Scotland Yard chased him across the Atlantic and arrested him in New York. To put this in some kind of historical context, when the detective from Scotland Yard, the detective from the UK, arrived in New York, he actually found it very difficult to work with the Americans, because the Americans, they had grandparents that had fought in the American War of Independence. So there was still a strong feeling of anti-British sentiment when this guy went across to the UK to apprehend this killer. Now, the murder of Thomas Briggs was not really something quite special. It was not really. It was pretty common to read about these murders, these muggings. There was not much of a police force at the time. The interesting thing is the legacy of the Briggs murder. This was one of the first examples of the Victorians taking on the consequences of a violent crime. For example, after the Briggs murder and after Franz Müller was sentenced to death, communication cords were installed in the trains. So if there was a problem, if any of the passengers had a problem, they could reach up and pull the communication cord and stop the train if there was an emergency. This had never happened before. Nobody had thought about this. One of the problems with the Thomas Briggs murder was that in the carriages, in the train carriages themselves, it was actually possible to be trapped with someone who wanted to kill you. There was no way of traveling from one carriage to another. This design was changed because of the Victorians, because they were thinking about how to improve safety, how to prevent this from happening again. Circular peepholes for the carriages that couldn't be adapted, for the carriages that couldn't be redesigned and linked together, circular peepholes were actually added to the older carriages so that the train staff could check on the passengers, make sure that everybody was safe. No one had been mugged or stabbed or attacked in their carriages. Now, this is perverse. This is quite disturbing. But the lights, the peepholes that were put in, that were drilled into the holes, they weren't called Briggs holes. They were called Müller lights. They were actually named after the guy who killed him. It wasn't actually named after the victim, it was named after the guy who killed him. You can't get more disturbed than that. It shows you the way that the British mind really works in these things. Another famous murder was the murder committed by Maria Manning. Now, she was known as the Bermondsey Horror. She was Swiss. This already caused a sensation that she was a foreigner, and she had taken a lover while she was married to an Englishman. And when she got bored of the lover, Maria and her husband decided to murder the guy. This caused an absolute sensation. You can see here that she's quite, I mean, at the time she was quite an attractive woman. People were bowled over by this foreign beauty coming in and being put on trial. She was sentenced to death, and she continued to make trouble. She continued to stir up trouble. At the time of her trial, when she heard the sentencing, she, instead of kind of putting her head down and being led away quietly, she actually looked the judge straight in the eye and shouted, "Shame on England, shame on England. Foreigners have no rights in this country." And she was kind of right. At the time, there was a tremendous amount of what we call xenophobia. There was a tremendous amount of, there was a great feeling that the British, that the English were superior. They were intellectually superior to everybody else on the planet. We did, of course, the English did, of course, have an empire at the time. And they just thought that everybody in the world aspires to be an Englishman. Maria's waxwork, I don't know whether you know Madame Tussauds. It's a famous waxwork company. Maria Manning's waxwork was still on display in the 1970s in London. She was this famous. She had made this much of a sensation, this much of an impact on the British people. People still went to see her waxwork like they would go and see the waxwork of a pop star or a famous actor. Nearly 20 years later, in 1888, something happened that changed the course of almost every social policy in the UK. And it also gave horror writers a tremendous amount of material, even 25 years after the murders were committed. Jack the Ripper was a name that was given by the newspapers. It wasn't actually given, he didn't actually call himself this, and no one in the police force called him this. Jack the Ripper is the most popular name that we have for this unidentified serial killer. Another name was the Leather Apron, because people thought that the way that he attacked the corpses and the way that he left the corpses, he must either be a doctor or a butcher. So people would call him the Leather Apron. Before we have a look at, in a little bit more depth, at the legend of Jack the Ripper, we have to understand the prevailing idea, the prevailing national identity of the Victorians. People were going out all over the world. They were discovering new lands in Africa. They were just taking stuff, making money, sending slaves to America. And this had gone on for about 100 years. So the idea of Englishness had been cemented and solidified in the national consciousness. The idea that an Englishman was highly moral, he was always a good man, he would do things according to a sensible moral code that everybody could understand, was really kind of central to the idea of being English. This idea of an English gentleman having a stiff upper lip, being unemotional, no matter what tragedy, no matter what crisis would hit him, he would always remain unemotional, he would always be able to think his way through the problem. It was such a strong idea that no Englishman could possibly kill another Englishman or Englishwoman, that the newspapers, without any evidence, made the assumption that the killer was essentially foreign in character. Even without any evidence, even without any kind of comment from the investigating police force, the newspapers simply decided that Jack the Ripper was a foreigner. This, in turn, led to a dubious way of interpreting the evidence that was presented at the crime scenes. Once you've actually decided that the killer is a certain ethnic group or a certain religion or has a certain political ideology, you start to interpret the evidence that's presented in a certain way. Even the Chief Inspector Swanson, on 19th of October 1888, said that eyewitness reports had mentioned that there was a man who was foreign in appearance. Now you can imagine that as soon as the newspapers print this, with the previous allegations that he may well have been Jewish, he was killing in mostly the poor Jewish areas, and there was a big influx of Europeans and Irish Catholics and Jews. So there was a big kind of feeling of animosity towards the Jewish people at the time. The nicest thing that people wrote in the newspapers about Jack the Ripper was that if he was an Englishman, he was a mad Englishman, because only a mad Englishman could act like a foreigner and kill and commit these horrible, atrocious acts. One interesting aspect of the Jack the Ripper murders is the fact that shortly after the first victim, or the first and the second victims were discovered, letters began to appear in the national press. Now, with a case like this, it's going to be pretty routine that people will be writing in. There'll be all sorts of cranks and crackpots writing in, pretending to be the murder, confessing to the murders. There's been about 5 or 6 letters that have been actually attributed to the killer himself. This is because they've identified the handwriting. The handwriting on a few letters has been the same. It doesn't mean that the person who wrote the letters was the killer. It just means that the same person wrote the letters. But the details that appeared in the letters were things that hadn't been actually released to the public. They were in the confidential police reports, and only the killer and the police would know about them. No one in the newspapers would actually know about them. So this was the first letter. This was actually a postcard. It's known as the Saucy Jacky postcard. And it reads, "I was not codding, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jacky's work tomorrow, double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit, but couldn't finish straight off. Had not got time to get ears off for police, thanks to keeping last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper." Now, one of the details here is the reference to the double event. Later on, the next day, two victims were found dead. The killer actually attacked 2 victims. 2 women were found dead in Whitechapel, in the area that he was killing in. So this lends some credence, some credibility to this particular letter, that it was written by the killer. There's really kind of, it's all circumstantial evidence, really. Nothing can be really proved at this point. Most of these letters have actually been lost as well, and it's only thanks to the Victorian inventions, things like photography and chemistry, that we're able to actually see copies of the letters, because the police were actually, they thought about this, and they had the forethought to actually make photostat copies of the letters. The second letter is known as the From Hell letter. This is the most popular letter. This is probably the most famous letter. The Johnny Depp movie about the Jack the Ripper murders in London was actually called From Hell. This is the level of cultural impact that we're talking about. People know about these things. They haven't read a book, they haven't seen the movies, they just know that these things are connected with Jack the Ripper. This particular letter is interesting because it's not signed Jack the Ripper. The previous letters were signed Jack the Ripper. And it was written by someone who had a much lower literacy rate than the person who wrote the other letters. It's pretty much a consensus now among these experts, among these ripperologists, that it was done on purpose. The person actually wrote at a lower literacy level on purpose to confuse the police. I'm not going to actually go into into the details of this letter because it's very short and not very interesting. It's the most famous one, and it deserves to be looked at, and it deserves to be analysed. The actual content, unfortunately, is not really worth much. The Dear Boss letter. This is the one that started the whole thing. This is the one that captured the public's imagination. You can probably see from the photo there, I've only got the first letter on here, but you can probably see here the handwriting was neat. It's an educated person. The handwriting is neat, it's clean, it's readable, it's understandable. It was written to a Mr. Lusk, who was actually the chairman of the, I think it was the Citizens, something like the Citizens Safety Committee or something like this. So he was, the killer was writing these letters directly to the people that were responsible for keeping the public safe. He was mocking them, he was taunting them with these letters. It's the first, up to this point that the letter appeared in the press. The newspapers had just called this guy Leather Apron because butchers used to wear leather aprons. This really captured the public's imagination, this name Jack the Ripper. It had a certain sound to it, it had a certain ring to it, and as soon as people put a name to something, then they really get captivated by something. As soon as you put a name to something, people will follow it, people will do it. It elevates it in the public consciousness. People ate this stuff up. It was printed verbatim. The police had no idea how to actually go about tracking this killer down, and it was printed word for word in all the national newspapers. It was an absolute gold dust for the newspapers. They made millions and millions of pounds. Hundreds of these letters followed. The police had to sift through massive piles of these. And it was only a handful that have actually been considered genuine enough to be thought that they were actually written by the killer. One of the letters accompanied a human kidney, and one of the victims had her kidney removed. The thing about that was that it implied cannibalism. Now you can imagine that the English are considering themselves to be intellectually superior. The idea of cannibalism really strikes hard at the heart of this fear that Englishmen aren't savages. Only savages eat each other. But when one of the letters appeared with a human kidney and the claim that half of the human kidney had been eaten by the killer, this was just one of the, it was a real kind of psychological kick to the Victorian press. So why is the Jack the Ripper murder so popular? It's pretty much because of the newspapers. All the letters are considered to be hoaxes, and in fact some of the handwriting in the letters has been compared to diarists of people who lived at the time and kept diaries. So journalists, for example. And Bill Smith, who wrote for The Star, actually confessed in 1931 that he and a couple of his colleagues at the newspaper wrote the letters just to keep business alive. The reason why they've become more and more popular, this fascination with Jack the Ripper, with these horrible murders, the reason why it's become so popular is, as Dr. Heather Shaw says here, is that we can gaze at the post-mortem pictures of the victims of the Whitechapel murders in a way we feel less uncomfortable about. More recent murders are just too close. They're too modern, they're too recent. These Whitechapel murders, technology has moved on, society has moved on, society has been reformed in a lot of ways. We can actually look at them. It's as though we're looking at another world. We're looking at photographs from the dawn of photography. We're looking at police reports from the dawn of police investigating. We're looking at notes and assumptions that were made at the dawn of detecting. It really is looking at a different world, and it somehow makes us feel more comfortable. This was one of the Openshaw letters. This was sent to one of the doctors that identified the human kidney in the From Hell letter. You can see the handwriting is a little bit more chaotic. It's a little bit more kind of unorganized compared to the Dear Boss letter, but it does actually show that the killer was keeping track of these things, and he was singling out key people in the investigation in some kind of psychological need to mock the people. Okay. to mock the people that were actually involved in the case. So what do these letters mean? They're more than likely hoaxes. People have come forward, people have admitted to writing these things. They may have just wanted to get famous, to be associated with the Jack the Ripper case. We don't know. These people are long dead. The last person died in 1935. Handwriting analysis has confirmed the same person wrote some of the letters. The people that did write the letters, they've been confirmed by handwriting experts as being educated people. They've got good writing skill. They've got a good vocabulary. They've read a book or two, basically. The letters shouldn't be taken too seriously. They are more than likely hoaxes. And what of the Ripper legacy? Well, like the murder of Thomas Briggs, it focused attention on the slums of Whitechapel. It focused attention on the problems in society. There were lots of efforts, there were lots of private investment in the Whitechapel area. And as Willard and Willis noted, Jack the Murderer became Jack the Missionary. The murders allowed for social reform. They allowed for people to actually look at the way that people were living in the most poverty-stricken areas of London, and some kind of help was given to them. It's important to remember in the Jack the Ripper story that there are victims. 11 women died, and most of them were immigrants. They were from France, they were from Ireland especially. They had escaped the potato famine in Ireland and come to live in London. We shouldn't forget these victims. They were women, they had children, they had mothers, they had fathers, they were somebody's daughter. And the murders really focus attention on the idea that the way that people live, or the way that people are forced to live, doesn't actually kind of force a certain lifestyle on them. Where you live in the city does not dictate how you live your life. These women were killed because they were at their wits' end. They were working as prostitutes in a poor area of London. They weren't doing it because they wanted to do it. They were doing it because they had been denied opportunities by society. And it really is, even though Jack the Ripper is the person who killed them, and he's kind of the central character in a lot of these stories and movies and books and comics and whatever else, Victorian society is partially to blame. You can't be too aloof. You must be aware of what's going on around you, what's happening to people that are less fortunate of you. The name that was given to the killer is a testament to bad journalism. Journalism just for the sake of selling newspapers is bad journalism. It's bad writing. It's sensationalist reporting. It's what we call yellow journalism. Selling newspapers because you know that it will sell papers. This needs to be addressed, and it was addressed. And since then in the UK, we've had a lot of self-examinations of what goes on in the press and what goes into the newspapers. So the legacy of Jack the Ripper was basically acted as the catalyst of social reform, and reformed a lot of the ways that the rich think about the poor. These things happen all the time. These things, the name Jack the Ripper has inspired movies, it's inspired episodes of TV shows. There was an episode of Dracula that featured Jack the Ripper as a vampire figure. Just recently in Canada, in Ontario, the London Rippers changed their names, and they got a lot of protests from local women's rights groups that then actually changed their name, their team name, to something that was basically someone who went around killing women. The legacy of the Ripper has been elevated into a myth, and the real people have kind of become secondary players in there. It's really something that is a cornerstone of American culture. When the story was shipped to America, he became basically the epitome of evil. There was even a Batman story, a Batman comic, where Bruce Wayne goes back in time and chases Jack the Ripper through the streets of New York. You can't underestimate the strength of this character in British and American culture. It's very, very strong. And every year, every few years, you'll come across a movie, or you'll come across a comic book or a TV show that is based on this legendary figure now. But you have to remember that he's a legendary figure who went around murdering people with no feelings of guilt whatsoever. Okay. Stories date back to almost the first case that came out. The stories started coming out. People started making money. Students of the Ripper case, they're called Ripperologists. There's over 100 theories about who was Jack the Ripper. If you want to study more, you'll be called a Ripperologist. That's almost the end of this. I really do want to recommend a couple of books, well, three books before we finish. The first is A Very British Murder, the story of a national obsession. This is by Lucy Worsley. She's a very famous historian. She does some great work for the BBC. She's very accessible. She knows her stuff, and she presents stuff in a really fun way. Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution by Stephen Knight. Now, this book has actually been discredited as a hoax. Even as recent as 1976, people were writing fake books about Jack the Ripper. The most recent books you'll find, Patricia Cornwell, she claims that she's got the identity of the killer. She claims that it was Walter Sickert, a painter. This came out in 2002. They're really worthwhile books to read if you're interested in reading up on the legend of Jack the Ripper. Most of the photographs in this presentation, in fact all of the photographs in this presentation, came from Wikipedia. There's a great Wikipedia page that does a lot of comprehensive information. Go and check that out, go and read it, it's very well organized. Some of the bibliography we've been referencing: Rumbelow, Sugden, Walkowitz, Warwick and White. Some of these people, these are from my old university in Manchester, and they've written really good books, really good cultural analysis of the impact of Jack the Ripper on modern culture and popular culture, and the Western psyche especially. Thank you very much, and thanks for watching, and please don't have nightmares. Bye-bye.